Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes, Dad,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's get started, finally. So I'm Dennis Ortiz. I'm a master trainer for SAT, PSAT, and ACT, and a lot of other things too. I've been working here in the Middle East for about 16 years, but I've been working for the Princeton Review for about 20. So that's a little bit about myself. So Peter, next. Yeah. So this is basically the agenda for today. So we're going to start with I think which is the longest discussion, which is what's the PSAT, what's the SAT, and what's the ACT. And I'm pretty sure that you know the lot of you the second two. You might not know much about the first, but I'll discuss that. But more than defining them, which I will do as well, but I also want to put them in a context and why they're important and why you should take advantage of this and prepare now. Then we'll talk a little bit about a testing timeline, and I'll discuss that because everything's up in the air right now. But I'll give you the most current information that we have, and of course the part 3, which is how the Princeton Review can help. I'll outline a number of programs available to you, including there are tests coming up, practice tests, which I'll tell you about toward the end. Next. Okay, so the biggest mistake we see students and parents make is approaching college admissions as a game of winners or losers. So what that means is, so you want to get into a place and you get into it and you're like a winner, and then if you don't, you're a loser. Next. But I want to, next. Yes. So it is never, I want to put that in a context and show you why that's mistaken thinking, okay? It has never been easier to get into college than it is now. So what I mean is, and this is only stateside, I mean, Ruchika will discuss, I believe, stateside in Canada, really. She'll discuss more broadly, like UK and such. But in the US specifically, there are approximately 4,000, count them now, 4,000 colleges and universities. So that's why it's never been easier to get into college, because regardless of, if you make the right decisions, you will get in some place. So that's fact number 1. Next. Fact number 2, it's never been more difficult to get into college than it is now. So I know I just said it's never been easier, but the reason it's never been more difficult, we're thinking about the selective colleges here. So really the top, let's say 300, maybe 500, but it's never been more difficult because it's never been more difficult to be you if you are a 9th, 10th, or 11th grader. What I mean by that is there's a lot of requirements required of you guys. So it's really not that easy to be you, and putting together a portfolio or a decent admissions portfolio is quite difficult. Okay, next. All right. So, and this I'm going to go over very, very broadly because Ruchika will, I believe, talk about this. But I want you to understand that these are the big 3 components of your college admissions sort of portfolio, right? To the left, great grades. Okay, that goes without saying. Then to the right, great applications. And here, you might think, what is an application? Well, it includes your GPA, which are your grades in context, but it also includes things like your letters of recommendation, right? Your extracurriculars, et cetera, et cetera. So the point, and I'll get to test scores in a minute, but the point I want to make is that grades and applications, especially if you're in 11th grade, by the way, 10th and 9th, you have a bit more leeway. But grades and applications, if you're in 11th grade, are pretty much done deals. Right? You can't go back and redo your 9th grade or your 10th grade, right? And in terms of applications, like you can't go back and choose a different extracurricular or choose a different activity. So pretty much, if you're in 11th grade, grades and applications are locked into place, right? Now, what all three of you, 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, and even if I have some 12th graders, let me include you in there too, the test scores. So the point is, and this is what the majority of the discussion is going to be, that the test scores are sort of what you have the most power over, right? So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the discussion. Next. Okay, fear or stress? Stress less about the test. You can. Next. What is the PSAT, SAT, and ACT? Next. So all of them, well, SAT and ACT are essentially university admissions tests, right? And I'll talk about them more. The PSAT is the practice SAT. So it's, as you see on the screen, it's just like the SAT, but shorter. It actually is just like the SAT. It's about 2 hours and 45 minutes, whereas the SAT is approximately 3 hours and 3 hours and 50 minutes with the essay, which I'll discuss. Does it have the same sections? Yes, math and evidence-based reading and writing. The only thing is that on the PSAT, you don't have an opportunity to write the essay. When is the PSAT administered? Every year in October. But of course, you can take it at different times depending on whether your school, gives the PSAT. But in most cases, the PSAT is administered in October. And just a point for you 10th graders. So the PSAT will sort of count, and if you could see me, I'm doing air quotes, sort of count if you do it in your junior year, which is 11th grade, in October, right? And more importantly, if you happen to be a US citizen, let me just shout out to you guys, the PSAT is quite important. The PSAT doubles as the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, which means you can get money out of them, right? If you're not a US citizen, which I imagine the vast majority of you are not, the PSAT is still quite important because it sets you up for success on the SAT, because again, it's essentially the same test, and you can get a much better idea. So if you take the PSAT in 9th and 10th grades, for example, you have a much better idea of where you stand on the SAT. So when it comes time to take the SAT, you'll have a much clearer idea of what goals to set and what kind of schools you can apply to, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, how is it scored? So the SAT, as we'll see in a second, is 400 to 1600, right? But the PSAT, being shorter, is just 160 to 760, meaning a perfect score, quote unquote, is a 1520. Okay, next. Okay, so so here we have the PSAT sections, evidence-based reading and writing, of course, as I said. There are 60 minutes for the reading. On the SAT, there are 65 minutes, which is 5 minutes shorter. And there are 47 questions on the PSAT. There are 52 questions on reading on the SAT. So it's reading and vocabulary and context. I can talk about that later if you wish. Writing is grammar, essentially. And so you see it's much simpler, and it goes much more quickly. So it's 35 minutes and 44 questions. By the way, that's the exact same time that the writing is on the SAT. So that's unchanged. The math ranges over 70 minutes, but there are two sections in the math. One is let's go down to the bottom first. One is a 25-minute no calculator section, which means you cannot use a calculator, obviously. And then the second and longer section is a calculator, 1 45-minute calculator, no calculator section. So a calculator section, calculator optional. So that means that you can use a calculator if you wish, but you are not required to. Next. Okay, so the PSAT scoring, again, as I said, so the reading is 8 to 38, the writing is 8 to 38, the math is 8 to 38. So just to give you a sense, on the SAT, that would be 10 to 40 for each, right? So anyway, so the verbal, now if you see this, and this is going to be the same on the SAT, the reading and writing, though they're different tests, they're radically different, are combined to give you one verbal score. So that's true here as well, right? So you see a section score of 160 to 760, 200 to 800 on the SAT. And then the math, of course, even though there are two sections, is one score. So that's 8 to 38, sorry, and 160 to 760 for the total score. Next. So, and everything I say here about the PSAT also basically is about the SAT as well. There are only 4 answer choices per question, exclamation point. Guessing penalty, there is no longer any guessing penalty on either the PSAT or the SAT. So there's no penalty for wrong answers. You should not leave anything blank. And letter of the day, which is what LOTD means, is what we tell our students when they don't want to deal with a question, which when you don't want to deal with it at all, just pick one letter and say, I'm going to pick C, for example, and then you just, and maybe you'll be lucky, but you don't lose anything by getting anything wrong. Okay. Now, charts and graphs, as it says here, are not just for math and science class. So there's clearly charts and graphs on the math section of the test, obviously, on both the PSAT and the SAT. But charts and graphs also appear on the reading test and even on the writing test. And occasionally, I know this is PSAT, but occasionally even on the essay. So next. So what is the SAT, ACT anyway? So So again, as I said, it's used for admissions, but more importantly, and this is for particularly for any parents in the audience, I think they would be interested in this. It is used to award financial aid. Next. Yeah. So nearly every university accepts both. So that's important because in the States, SAT or ACT is the big thing, right? But when I was a kid, which was a long time ago, admittedly, but I'm from New York City, so it's SAT led. And I didn't really know about the ACT till I came out to the Middle East. But now, a lot of students in the US, I think for the last 5 years have preferred the ACT, just to give you a sense. And I'll tell you more about that as we continue. But there are key differences between the two tests, and I'll go over that. Next. Yeah, so both are very different from what you're probably used to. Correct. Next. So it's allegedly, I would emphasize that word, an accurate predictor of academic mastery and potential. But next, but like all standardized tests, that claim is demonstrably untrue. And demonstrably, because there have been studies that show that what they claim, which is that the ACT and or the SAT is a pretty decent barometer of how a student would perform in university, but that's actually proven to be false because, and they actually show that through various tests, which include gender differences. As such, doing well on these tests is a skill that can be trained. So both the SAT, well, all three of them, the PSAT, the SAT, and the ACT, I'm just going to say, is a contentless test, by which I mean that the content, while content is important, it isn't what is actually being tested. What's actually being tested is a number of other skills, including how to avoid traps. So yes, it is a skill that can be trained. Next. So what the ACT and the SAT are not, or the PSAT, I would add, reliable measures of academic performance. Yes, they are not, because what is that? Actually, on your application, of course, that is your grade point average, your GPA, right? That is your measure of how you have performed academically, right? Nor are they comprehensive tests of knowledge and mastery, which would have to be a much longer test than 3 hours. Okay, next. So, nor is it a fun way to spend $100 on a Saturday morning. Correct. Next. So, what should you think about? Okay. So, and this is just a selection because there's many things you need to think about. But you need to think about university application deadlines and available test dates. And I'll go through, there's a screen later on where I'll talk about SAT and ACT test dates. Again, let me just make a point, especially for parents. These are provisional at the moment because we really don't know, right, with the situation as it is. But nevertheless, yeah, you have to think about the application dates versus the available test dates. Just a point about, before I move on to the second point, about the SAT. I mean, before all this began, the SAT internationally, which I assume most of you will be taking it internationally, is only available 4 times, was only available, let me say, 4 times a year. What is it? It's March, May, October, and December. So now, with everything, the March and May test, as I'm sure you know, was canceled. So, presumably the June test is still on, but we don't know that yet. So anyway, so I just want to make that point. Now, if you were to take the SAT in the States, you have many more opportunities. You have like 8 or 9. So that's a difference that I want to flag for you guys. Potential conflicts with other exams. Look, so, you know, and I realize that all of these have been canceled, like IB tests I know have been canceled, and GCSE tests have been canceled for June anyway, but you will have to take them at some point, right? Not to mention the SAT subject tests, which I will maybe discuss in a later screen, and AP tests if you're doing APs. So you have much to think about. So you should think about your exams, set up a schedule, and see where SAT and or ACT fits in, along, of course, with preparation for that. And university score requirements. Yeah, so you need to think about where you want to go and what they require. Next. But wait, there's more. Okay, which test is best for you? And I'll discuss later on, like in a screen or two, I'll discuss the differences between SAT and ACT and which ones you might perform better in. How you prepare for it? That's a good question. And how are you performing right now? Which is also a good question, which I can answer later on. Next. So what do these tests measure? Okay, so do they measure intelligence? Well, we discussed that already, right? I believe that's false. Can they be used to award aid? Yes. And aid, of course, for those of you who don't know, is financial aid primarily. Do they reflect your GPA in high school? Well, we discussed that as well. No, they don't. That's false. Do they predict your college GPA? I said no, right? So that is also false. Can they be prepared for? Yes, true. They can be prepared for. Should they be prepared for? Triple yes, I would say, but it only has one check mark. Yes, right? You should not go into this test thinking, oh, I can ace it, because even though I understand it, no. You should be fully prepared for what you're going to encounter, which means really understanding the nature of the test. Now, last question on this page, does it test what you've learned in high school? Well, that depends. Because let's say for the math, again, there is content as part of the SAT, and content we will review in a course setting, of course. But so much of the content, at least let's use the math as an example. On the math side of things, the content will be mostly familiar to you guys, especially if you're in 10th and 11th grade. But the way the question is asked, that's what might be radically different. So this is what you need to prepare for. Next. Okay, so here you see a comparison. So again, we've already talked about the SAT scoring, essentially with the PSAT scoring, but here you see it, 200 to 800, of course, each side, right? Verbal on the one hand, which is 2 tests, reading and writing, and math. So that's a total of 400, 1600. Now, let me just talk about ACT scoring for a minute, because as you see, especially for those of you not familiar with the ACT, the ACT is basically from 1 to 36. And I'm convinced that that's why that hasn't taken off in this part of the world, because, you know, if you say, oh, my child got 1450 on the SAT, that's impressive. But if you say, oh, my child got a 35, which by the way is a fantastic score, you know, it doesn't resonate as much with people who don't know. So I'm convinced that's why the ACT is not caught on, but I'm hoping that changes. So one other thing is you see that on the ACT, there's a composite, right? Which means that there's that basically what you get reported is the composite score. So I just want to make a point that it's easier to hide. Let's say you have a deficiency in reading, right? It's easier to hide that on the ACT than the SAT, because again, the composite score is what's reported. Next. Okay, so the SAT section by section. Reading is 65 minutes. As I said, remember the PSAT was 60 minutes. 52 questions. Writing and language, same as I said, 35 minutes, 44 questions. The math no calculator section is 25 minutes and 20 questions. Math calculator is 55 minutes, 38 questions. By the way, this math section is only, the whole math section is only 10 minutes longer, approximately. Yeah, 10 minutes longer than the PSAT. And the essay, which is 50 minutes from beginning to end. So I want to say something about the essay. On the SAT, now this doesn't necessarily apply to the essay on the ACT, but I'll get there in a minute. So with the essay, it's 3 minutes and 50 seconds. So, sorry, 3 hours and 50 minutes, sorry, for 154 questions. So that's a long test. But the essay occurs at the end of the test, theoretically. So you can take the test without the essay, and you can take it with, as you see below, right? So with the essay, it's $64.50 plus $47 non-US regional fee. Okay, so that's where they get the $100 from approximately. And then without the essay, it's $47.50 plus again the $47 of the non-US regional fee. Now, I just want to make a point. So, in terms of the essay, I believe that only the California school system, meaning the university system, is the only university system in the States which still requires the essay. So that's why you see optional written after essay, okay? But I just want to make this clear. All schools, especially top schools, like let's say top 100 schools, require some kind of writing sample, okay? So even if they don't require the essay, most schools will require some kind of writing sample. And what I mean by writing sample, I just don't mean like, you write a short story or something and send it in. No, I mean like a writing sample that you've done for school. So usually an academic paper or something. And most of them will require not only that you send in that paper, but they will require, like, for example, if you have multiple drafts, if you have teachers' comments on the drafts, so they ask for those kinds of things, okay? So if you don't have anything like that, or you don't think, or if your curriculum, for example, doesn't do that, or whatever, or you don't feel comfortable with that, then you may want to take the essay. That's the point, okay? Sorry to be so long-winded, but that's what, right? So I would put optional under air quotes. Okay, next page. So this is the ACT section by section. Now the English is the same as the writing, which is basically the grammar, right? So this is 45 minutes and 75 questions, which is quite a lot, by the way. The math section is 60 minutes and 60 questions, which means you're quite under the gun. The reading is 35 minutes, 40 questions. And the science, which I'll talk about in just a minute, the science is 35 minutes and 40 questions, right? And the writing, again, optional, but as everything I said for the SAT kind of applies here as well. But this is 40 minutes only and one essay, and it essentially involves different perspectives and such. Next. What is a good score? That's a good question. Next. Okay. So a good score is essentially anything that you get that gets you into where you want to go, and even better if it gets you in with money, hence the screen, okay? So these are some colleges and universities, or 2 colleges and 3 universities. And just to give you guys a sense, a college, just to give you a bit of US nomenclature, a college is essentially a 4-year, I think you would say university if you're sort of Britishly inclined, if that's a word. So that would be a college. So a university includes graduate work. So that's the US way of thinking of that, right? So you have Columbia, which I went to as a graduate student, but you also have Williams College, which is where I went to as an undergraduate, okay? Both of which are quite selective, and you get essentially you need a high SAT score for both. Then you've got some others, Duke, which is in the South, 1560, Stanford, which is out in California, also 1560, and Pomona, which is 1490. Pomona's kind of like a little Ivy. I would say that the Williams and Pomona, among others like Amherst, etc., or little ivy. So this gives you an idea of what kind of merit award. Now, Ruchika will talk more about this, but there are different kinds of scholarships, right? There are need-based, which I believe need-based is not entirely, but it's pretty much reserved for US citizens. But merit-based is not. Merit-based is open. And merit-based means that, not that you need the money, but that you kind of deserve the money. So, if your SAT or PSAT or ACT scores are good enough, think of it as like schools will pay you to go to them. And this is what's reflected on this screen. Next, what are the key differences between the SAT and the ACT? Next. So, on the SAT, again, there's a no calculator section, and it's approximately 1 minute and 15 seconds per question. Now, this is if you finish all of them, but on the yes calculator section, which is the second section actually, it's a little bit longer. It's 1 minute 27, right? But on the ACT side, it's just one math section. It's again 60 minutes and 60 questions, so it's 1 minute per question. Now, I just want to say, and maybe we'll talk about this later, but the ACT math is slightly more complicated than the SAT math. I'll just give you a sense. Like, for those of you in 11th grade, they have logarithms on the ACT, whereas logarithms never appear on the SAT. Now, that being said, I find the ACT questions much less tricky, right? And that will be reflected later on, okay? So on the verbal, again, writing language is the same as English, and you'll see the differentials there in terms of timing. The reading, again, it's almost the same, and the essay. Now, I want to say something about the reading, because on the essay, reading comprehension, on the SAT, okay, the only major difference between the SAT and the ACT that I can see is that on the SAT, reading comprehension is mostly in order. In other words, if you see like a question toward the beginning of the passage, right, and it's a specific question, it will be sorry, if the question is first, it'll most likely be at the beginning of the passage, and then the next question will follow. Okay, the ACT, while the reading is much simpler, in fact, what makes it more difficult, because they have to make up for that difference, is that the questions are kind of all over the place, right? So you can start with like a question that's on like line 80, which doesn't really happen on the SAT. So that's one differential. Next, can you give me the bottom screen? Yeah, okay. So again, the math on the SAT, again, these are the topics: heart of algebra, problem solving and data analysis, advanced math. By the way, on the PSAT, kind of advanced math kind of goes away. So there's not, maybe there's one or two, but there's not that much advanced math on the PSAT. And additional topics, which is like plain geometry, basically. Next. And the verbal, again, writing and language, as is the same as English on the ACT, is editing and proofreading. Reading, of course, is reading comprehension. An optional essay is, and this is a fairly complicated issue, but this is like analysis of a passage. So in this essay, you don't put your own, your own opinion on it. In fact, one thing I like to say to my students is on the SAT essay, no one cares about your opinion, because I think that gets through to them. Whereas on the ACT, they do. So next. So again, the ACT, as you see here, algebra, you can see that it's quite a bigger chunk. And geometry is still on this test. So I just want to make a point, because the SAT geometry, plain geometry I'm talking about now, like, basic triangles, circles, etc., has been reduced in emphasis because they claim that there's really no function, except if you're an architect, I guess, there's no function for plane geometry in the real world, okay? But ACT still has an emphasis on geometry, as you see 20 to 30%. And the coordinate geometry, which again, there's more on the ACT than the SAT, is about 15 to 20%. Next. So again, as I said earlier, the English is the same as the ACT writing, the reading is the same, except for what I talked about earlier, the order. And here, the optional essay, it's about comparing viewpoints. So on this essay, you do need to put forth your opinion, otherwise known as a thesis. So that's one of the major differences between the ACT and the SAT essay. Next. Yeah, let's talk about the science. I know that you guys were, some of you maybe are freaking out about that. So next page. Yeah, can you just, yeah, all right. So this is what, they're just trying to freak you out. But relax, because look, the science, let me just say about the science isn't actually about science. It's more like reading charts. Remember on the SAT, there were charts and graphs, and I said they were everywhere. Well, this is like the science section on the ACT. They're essentially equivalent. So, you know, you don't have to know too much about chemistry or about biology or any specific science. It's just really how to read graphs. So relax, everything's fine. Next page. Summary of key differences. I've already talked about this. Now, on the SAT, again, there's a no calculator section, which is about 25 minutes. On the ACT section, it's all calculator, exclamation point. Not that I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but still. Then on the science section is different, but it's essentially the same as charts and graphs on the SAT. Okay. Advantages on the SAT, on average, it's more time per question, but on the other side of things, ACT, the questions are more straightforward. So you don't have to worry so much about misreading the question, which is something that happens a lot on the SAT. Trust me. So questions are trickier and more complex on the ACT side, and also brutal word problems. And that's important because on the SAT, you know, reading comprehension is a part of everything you do, including math. So that's important to understand. Whereas on the ACT, there's less time per question, of course, and there's heavy emphasis on verbal skills, yes, but not as complicated as the SAT. So that's a lot to think about. Anyway, next page. So how many times should you take the SAT and the ACT? Okay, so we say to you guys, prepare to take either one once, plan to take them at least twice, because most people do, but do not take either test more than 3 times. That's good advice, because look, if you're taking the SAT more than 3 times, if you can fit that into your schedule, you know, an admissions officer would say, doesn't this student have anything better to do than to take the SAT 5 times or the ACT 5 times, right? Because you have a lot of other things to take too, not least the SAT subject tests or APs and your own exams. And so you have a lot to do. So you should plan to take each test for a maximum of 1 second. What was that? Okay, so if you take the SAT or the ACT multiple times, then you can send all of your composite scores with the scores choice option. Okay, so let me explain what score choice is. So score choice is when you, let's say you have like let's do ACT as an SAT as an example, sorry, because that's what I know. SAT is, let's say you get 600 on the reading and 700 on the math. I'm just being very, very optimistic. So, and let's say you want to take it again because you want to bring up your reading score, right? So you take it again and you get, let's say, 700 on the reading, but the math drops to like, 550 or something, right? So most schools, but you have to do research on this, but most US schools do composite scores, right? So that means they take your highest score regardless of when it was. So you don't have to get like a certain score in one sitting. You can sort of rely on 2 or 3 tests to build up your best score, okay? That's called a super score, okay? And increasingly, ACT is also super scoring, or rather that the schools are taking the super score with the ACT as well. But let me do a caveat. You have to do research because some schools definitely do not do super scoring, okay? So you really need to do your research on this, okay? So should you take both? Not if you can help it. You'll need time to prepare separately for each because the ACT, there's an added layer, which I want to talk about in a second. Anyway, next screen. So official test dates, SAT. Again, this is, again, a question mark. This is especially for you parents out there. Now, a couple of things about this screen. So still, the June test is still theoretically the next available SAT date. Okay, but we don't know that, right? Especially because in the States right now, essentially things are falling apart. So we don't know whether they're going to actually have the wherewithal to give this test. So, June should be on the screen, but put a big asterisk near June. Now, again, none of these are confirmed. This is why there's a question mark. But so especially if there's no June test, okay, most likely the next test will be late August. Okay, and then hopefully everything will go back to normal. So then October, December, and March. So and they're so they're kind of making up for the fact that they have canceled 2 tests, right? So anyway, next screen. So yeah, I just want to say this about the ACT. Now, internationally, the ACT has been for about a year and a half now, I believe. It has been computer-based. I think they're moving toward that in the States, but since we're international, right? So one thing I want you to be, so everything I said about the ACT is true, except that it's computer-based. So you have to, and again, this is another reason to not take both tests, right? Because if you want to learn certain skills, you need to learn them for the computer kind of thing. So you need to, for example, in a reading